Hello, Cadre 3. This is video number 3 in that four-part series. And this is entitled Top Down, Bottom Up, question mark, It Matters. And this is part of the design notion of systems and organizations, and that the way the organization is designed has everything to do with how it operates, what it does, how it gets its work done, how it focuses its time, energy, and resources on the work to be done, and so forth. And basically, it's a contrast between the organizational structure that is a hierarchy, think triangle with a peak, versus a distributive model, which is like a set of concentric circles, a center, a next circle, a next circle, a next circle, and so forth. And each of those play a different role. Each of those contrast with each other in some very direct kinds of ways that I think it's important for anyone who's going to play any kind of a leadership role, whether you're at the top of the peak or in the center of the distributive model, needs to understand the effects of operating as in a hierarchy or operating in a more distributive kind of model. Again, think triangle or think pyramid in terms of the hierarchy kind of thing. And it's very important that leaders in an organization who desire a more collaborative kind of approach, distributing the work, distributing the accountability, distributing the results, the credit, the discredit, all those kind of things, needs to think about how in the world you can tear down the walls of most typical hierarchies, because organizations do tend to drift toward hierarchies, especially if there isn't a concerted effort to do things differently. And it's almost part of the natural DNA of an organization to be hierarchical, in that there's a CEO or president or whatever at the top, and then it cascades down to numbers of other kinds of employees who do different kinds of work. And I think the most important thing is to recognize both the good and the bad and the ugly, so to speak, of the hierarchies versus the more distributive kinds of models. Well, first of all, let's think about this in a real context of what a school or a college, university, post-secondary education would look like, and they basically all have a tendency to look the same. And especially, and I'll use the K-12 because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but again, you can apply this quite easily to most any level of education, and most not-for-profits, many private organizations. In fact, business and industry is largely, with the exception of a few organizations, based upon the pyramid or hierarchy kind of model. In the case of public education and higher education, you have this local model, which is the base structure of the local school system: the board, the superintendent, the principals, the teachers, the non-certified staff. And more so recently than, say, 50 to 100 years ago, obviously, the state didn't play a very prominent role. But once state aid to schools became the norm rather than the exception, and states began to fund more heavily what local schools are all about, the states played a more active role. And so on top of this local hierarchy or triangle, there sits another triangle, which is the state triangle: State Department of Education, Commissioner, Legislature, Governor, and so forth. And then while the federal intervention or federal entrance into schools has been there for a long, long time, under the guise of, or under the notion that the welfare of the American people is preserved and protected by some level of intervention, particularly when it's around certain problems, like the way we got driver ed started was through federal grants based on highway statistics that high school age kids were having the most accidents and the most deaths on the highway. Same thing in terms of career and technical education, or what used to be vocational education. The same is true for Title I. Always trying to serve some need that was out there, but not getting too far into the regulatory aspect of it. However, the advent of No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and so forth, and post-secondary is experiencing this as well. You have the federal hierarchy now on top of the state one, which is the U.S. Department of Education, Congress, and the President. And think about it in terms of three hierarchies balanced on the peak of each one, the local, the state, the federal, and the connection is pretty tenuous at best, although through the regulatory process, particularly at the federal level, there's been a tendency to push that triangle down on top of the state, and then the state has pushed its triangle down on top of the local. So it's really blurred what had been traditional lines of authority and responsibility. Here's the issue. When you've got the three triangles, one of the things that is very important in an organization in terms of its effectiveness is being able to identify the structural core. You know, it was the central core. And in the case of the three triangles, your eyes would go immediately to the middle triangle as if the state were the central core of the school system. Well, guess what? The state is not the central core of the school system. It is constitutionally the responsibility of the state of Nebraska to provide for the education of children age 5 through age 21, but there is no constitutional responsibility for post-secondary education in Nebraska, so that really doesn't hold a lot of water, but it's in the middle. And if you think about, at least in my notion, of what is the work of the K-12 system in higher education, it's the education or the teaching and the learning process, and certainly that does not occur at the state level. It certainly doesn't occur at the local or at the federal level. And so here we have the function, which I think most people would say is the primary work or the core work, clear down at the bottom. In fact, it isn't even recognized on there because students are not even part of that triangle. We act as if students are some kind of an afterthought. And the notion that students were part of the working core of the organization just simply seems to be lost on the traditional hierarchy kind of system. Well, if you can't identify the core structure, then it's pretty hard to identify the core work. In fact, the core work's pretty vague. We've got folks who, as superintendents of schools, for example, who think they're the ones that do the core work. We've got folks in the State Department of Education, and we've got folks in the legislature and governors who think K-12 education and higher education is their responsibility. And for some reason, the feds have taken on the issue of having a responsible role in both the K-12 as well as post-secondary education. So when you don't have a core that's clearly identified, the core work becomes very vague, very fragile, very segmented. People have different opinions as to what that core work is. Here's part of the issue. In a hierarchy system, whether you're talking local, state, federal, or the whole local, state, federal system, hierarchies tend to pull everything up to the top. So such things as discretion, decision-making, initiative, authority, accountability, responsibility, all those things tend to begin at the top. And then because of the position that people are in, I am the president, we are the Congress, we are the U.S. Department of Education, or in the case of the state, I am the governor, we are the legislature, we are the State Department of Education, and so forth. Therefore, we take our part of each of those things, initiative, discretion, decision-making, authority, responsibility, accountability. We take our part off of there, and it gets a little bit less and a little bit less as you get down. So when you get clear down to the bottom, where most of the work is really being done, there isn't much left in terms of initiative and discretion and authority, accountability, responsibility, and so forth. And I think those of you that have been around a while have felt that transition and the fading of that local sense of autonomy, something we call local control. It's been eroded dramatically over the last 20 years, and especially the last 10 with No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top, including the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, which shows a lot of the same kinds of notions embedded within it that No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top have for the K-12 system. A distributive model is basically what we said it is. It's this center of circles that go out, and it distributes initiative, discretion, authority, responsibility. Everybody shares. It's a collaborative effort that everybody has a role in each of those kinds of things in terms of initiative, authority, accountability, responsibility, and so forth. And so then when you begin to look at a more distributive model, the thing that it it is very clear is it has a clear center. It's the center circle. And when an organization has a clear structural core, it's usually quite clear about the core work because it's done in that center. And that's the whole purpose of the center, is to organize everything around the core work. So if you apply that to the public schools, the state kind of model, you've got the classroom at the center. The next layer outside the classroom are the classroom teachers. The next layer are the principals. The next layer is the board and the superintendent. The next layer should be the state and the federal government. And wouldn't it be nice if they would hold hands and support that system? But everybody has a role to play. Everybody's supporting that core work that begins in the classroom, extends primarily to the leadership of teachers, then to the principals, then to the superintendents, and so forth. And nobody's role is diminished in that model. It's just they have a different role than carving off pieces of the management side of things, authority, accountability, responsibility, initiative, all those kind of things, as opposed to what is it they need to do to provide the best support to the circle around which they are located. So having a clear core makes it clear what the core work is all about. And that makes it possible. And there's a slide that is a part of the PowerPoint that is also posted on Blackboard, that when you get clear about the core center and you get clear about the core work, you get the core work having a reflection that really exposes what the outcome is. In other words, teaching, if you place the words teach on a mirror, the reflection back up from the mirror is learn. And it shows it in one of those slides. And I love that slide because it basically says that's what we're supposed to do. And I don't care whether you're post-secondary or whether you are K-12 or whatever, but teaching and learning are supposed to be a reflection of each other when the core is clear and that core work is clear. The second part of that hierarchy versus distributive model has to do with how roles get assigned. Remember, in the hierarchy model, everything comes down from the top, so you begin to define who's at the top, and let's just use the local model for this purpose, in that the role of the board is to administer and give oversight to everything. And there are a number of boards. In fact, as commissioner, I encountered this all the time, about local boards who basically said, we're in charge of everything. And they did everything from set the budget to hire the superintendent to even hire the coaches to even vote on who was going to be cheerleader, who was elected to National Honor Society. They basically were in charge of everything. And the superintendent, as a result, was basically a manager of those things that the board directed him or her to do. Once you then define that as a management role, the superintendent, then the principal's role becomes a learning management thing, which has often been described as being an instructional leader. Leader is probably an oxymoron in this particular case, but the job is to manage instruction. And this is why, to people who are in that role as a learning manager and people who think that is exactly what the role of a principal is, they tend towards scripted instruction, very clear instructions to what teachers are supposed to teach, how they're supposed to teach. They tend to like testing, they tend to like standards, they tend to like all those things that prescribe and give little discretion to the classroom teacher. And then the teacher is simply there to teach. And if that's all teachers are there to do, that system is not going to be very effective. As opposed to a distributive model that begins with the core and defines the roles from the core outward. In other words, teachers have to take an instructional leadership role. They know their content. They know the strategies that go with teaching that content. They know the kinds of things that you need to do to differentiate curriculum and instruction for different kinds of kids. They know the strategies that are necessary to teach in a high poverty situation, kids that are highly mobile, kids that are learning the English language, kids that have disabilities, and so forth. Well, when you begin defining the role of a teacher as more of a leadership role, then the next leadership role of the principal becomes not an instructional leader, but a leader of learning. And for example, that means that it's up to the principal to find out and to guide the system to find out who's learning, what is it they're learning, who's not learning, what is it they're not learning, and what are we going to do as a system about both of those things. How are we going to move the learning forward? How are we going to close instructional or, achievement gaps, and those kinds of things. Once the principal is defined as a leader of learning, to me the superintendent's role is very clear. The superintendent is the education leader, which means to me they're in charge of system improvement or school improvement. And that's a role that is absolutely missing in a lot of our schools, is that the superintendent role has been largely management defined and not as a leader to make the system work better. In other words, school improvement needs to have the leadership of the superintendent, because that's the person who can put the resources together, the time, the money, the professional development, all those things that create the capacity to do this teaching, learning kind of reflection. And then when the superintendent becomes the education leader, the board has a totally different role, and that's the policy leadership role that most boards should aspire to. In other words, what are the policies, the practices, the resources, the priorities, the goals, those kind of things that are necessary to be set so that the system can work, and that the priority or the work of the principals, superintendents, teachers, and all that is guided by a clear set of priorities and a set of directions that's designed to make the system improve and the system to work as effectively as it possibly can. So it matters whether it's top down or bottom up, because they're dramatically different in each case. Now, I don't think there's any organization that's ever going to get to the point where it's totally a distributive model. There are organizations which are totally hierarchical models, and some of them for a while are very effective. Usually over time they're not. But somewhere in between, it seems to me that what a leader in an organization, somewhere in between, yes, in the case of schools and universities, by statute and by tradition, they tend to be hierarchical, but they can also behave in more distributive kinds of ways. I don't think there's anything inconsistent with a hierarchical model that behaves in a distributive way, when in fact recognizing that the core work of the institution is teaching and learning, and then begin to think about the roles of various groups and individuals in that hierarchy as to how do they support that. So the point of it is that hierarchies tend to work in certain ways, distributive models tend to work in certain ways. Somewhere in between that pushes more and more against that hierarchy to move it toward a distributive model is probably the most important work of a leader. Well, that concludes this video, and there is a PowerPoint that's attached to it, so you can see some of the visual models that I was talking about as we went through. And maybe if you're tech savvy enough, I still can't figure out how to load those PowerPoints onto the video. You can listen to the video and click through the PowerPoint slides as you go.